For instance, research by Murray and Holmes, 1997, suggests that persons with low self-esteem may wish more to avoid disappointments than to believe they are truly appreciated by someone. Such persons may distrust their dating or marital partners and doubt their love, devotion, and respect for themselves. Individual differences in wishful thinking. Because of various temperamental or socialization factors, individuals may differ in the degree to which their judgments are impacted by approach or avoidance motivations toward specific closures. As a first step toward tapping such stable individual differences, Segal, Kruglanski, and Fayek, 1999, developed a wishful thinking scale on the basis of Weinstein's, 1980, study of unrealistic optimism. In his research, Weinstein asked college students to compare the likelihood that each of 42 life events, e.g., being fired from a job or gaining statewide recognition in one's profession, would happen to them as opposed to other students at the college of the same sex as the respondent. The results indicated that overall there was a very strong tendency for participants to be unrealistically optimistic. Individuals estimate that they would be more likely than others to experience positive life events, and less likely than others to experience negative life events. The wishful thinking scale, Segal, Kruglanski, and Fayek, 1999, largely derived from Weinstein's questionnaires, affords the computation of a wishful thinking score for each separate individual. The score reflects the degree to which the individual perceives the likelihood of positive events occurring for him or her as higher, and of negative events as lower, than to other similar persons, college students. As Segal, et al., 1997, have shown, wishful thinking is not the same as optimism, e.g., Shire and Carver, 1985. Whereas optimism represents general positivity, both with respect to oneself and with respect to others, and does not generally differentiate between gradations of outcome positivity, negativity, wishful thinking is sensitive to such gradations, hence it differentiates between positive, negative outcomes occurring to oneself versus similar outcomes occurring to others. Research by Segal et al. Demonstrated that wishful thinking, as a dimension of individual differences, affects persons' tendencies to overestimate their academic grades in college, reduces their responsiveness to corrective feedback about their exam performance, and induces the tendency to underestimate the amount of time an unpleasant task may take, and hence to unduly procrastinate prior to getting started. It is unclear at the present time whether the wishful thinking effects observed by Segal et al. In press reflect a stronger degree of approach or avoidance, motivation towards specific desirable or undesirable closures, or a greater degree of cognitive bias at the same degree of motivation. The precise mechanisms underlying wishful thinking effects may be profitably explored in subsequent research. 1. Consequences of motivations toward nonspecific and specific closure. Need for nonspecific closure, urgency and permanence biases leading to seizing and freezing. How might it feel to want a nonspecific closure? How might it affect the way we go about our affairs, and what impact might it have on ourselves and others around us? Given that an individual's need for closure is heightened, two fundamental consequences may ensue. First, the person may experience a sense of urgency about reaching closure. Second, once an initial closure was formulated, the individual may adhere to it what may and treat it as relatively permanent. The sense of urgency may prompt the tendency to seize quickly on any notion that promises closure. A person under a heightened need for closure may wish to have closure immediately. Any postponement of closure is experienced as bothersome, and the individual's overriding sense would be that he or she simply cannot wait. This may induce a kind of mental impulsivity in which one leaps to conclusions on the basis of skimpy evidence, renders judgments in terms of top-of-the-head notions, often reflecting prevalent societal stereotypes and prejudices, shoots from the hip in communicating to others rather than carefully adopting one's messages to the listener's perspectives, and so forth. The craving for permanence may induce the tendency to freeze upon an extant closure, but also to prefer a potentially lasting closure over a transient, context-specific closure. Individuals under a heightened need for closure may thus try to form an enduring, stable closure, and abhor the specter of having to part with closure. Both the sense of urgency and the quest for permanence reflect the simple notion that when the need for closure is aroused, the absence of closure is aversive. Individuals may wish to terminate this unpleasant state quickly, displaying the urgency tendency, and to keep it from recurring, displaying the permanence tendency. Belief crystallization and the demarcation of seizing from freezing. In an important sense, the seizing and freezing tendencies represent diametrically opposed epistemic attitudes. Seizing signifies an openness to novel ideas, whereas freezing denotes closed-mindedness, and hence the reluctance to seriously entertain them. Indeed, the need for closure may foster each of those contradictory tendencies in different circumstances. Whether seizing or freezing will ultimately occur should depend on whether the individual possessed crystallized closure to begin with. A person who lacked closure would, under a heightened need for closure, seize upon cues that promise its attainment, whereas a person who had closure would freeze upon it. An early study by Zajonc and Morissette, 1960, provides evidence that the degree to which beliefs are crystallized and held with certainty is inversely related to the tendency to change them in light of new information. Participants in this research estimated the number of bomb craters in aerial photographs. Change in stimulus or change in feedback, alleged judgments of experts, constituted the informational manipulations intended to induce change. It was found that persons whose judgments prior to the informational change were held with high subjective certainty changed only if their uncertainty level increased. Let us assume that high subjective certainty was partly driven by participants' need for closure, Kruglanski and Webster, 1996. Accordingly, it would appear that high need for closure participants whose beliefs became less firm for some reason were those who seized upon the new information, whereas those whose beliefs remained firm froze on those judgments and held on to them at length. Of course, Zajonc and Morissette, 1960, did not manipulate or assess either the participants' firmness of beliefs or their need for closure, and hence they could not investigate whether these two variables interacted in the predicted way to affect seizing and freezing. Two studies by Kruglanski, Webster, and Clem, 1993, attempted precisely such manipulations using a persuasion context to look at cognitive change. We formed dyads consisting of a naive participant and a confederate posing as a participant. The experimenter introduced the study as one concerned with the workings of legal juries. Each participant, and allegedly also her or his partner, were presented with the essentials of a legal case, a civil suit involving an airline company and a lumber company. For half the participants, the materials also included an alleged legal analysis allowing them to form a fairly definite opinion in favor of the defendant or the plaintiff. No legal analysis was given the remaining participants, who therefore lacked a firm informational base for their opinion. The experimental design was a 2x2 factorial with 2 degrees of the need for closure orthogonally crossed with whether the participants possessed or did not receive the legal advice, and hence whether they possessed a firm opinion on the issue they were confronting. We assumed that participants who received clear-cut legal advice would form a relatively firm judgment as to the case involved, whereas those who did not would have a substantially lower confidence in their views. The need for closure in this experiment was manipulated via environmental noise. In the noise condition, participants carried out the experimental tasks in the presence of considerable noise emitted by a rickety computer printer. In the control, quiet, condition, the printer remained inactive. Based on the logic outlined earlier, we assumed that the presence of noise would make information processing more laborious and costly, and hence that it would elevate participants' need for closure.